Elephants are fucking terrifying. You don't need to have been through what I have to realize that. Much has been made over the last few decades about how intelligent elephants are. It's been known for centuries that elephants have excellent memories and can be trained to respond to hundreds of commands, far more than dogs. But within the last 15 years or so, elephants have been documented recognizing their own image in a mirror, using tools, enjoying artistic expression, and even engaging in elaborate funerals and death rites that include grieving. It seems that every day, elephants become more human. Some believe that this should make us appreciate and respect them more. But me? It makes me more afraid of them. Here are a few numbers to explain my fear. 10 feet, the average height of an Asian elephant at the shoulder. 6 tons, the average mass of an Asian elephant. Note, their African cousins are larger. 25 miles per hour, the speed that elephants can run at. 661 pounds, the mass that elephants can lift. 10 feet, length of the longest elephant tusks. 500, the number of people killed by elephants every year. For comparison, that's more than are killed by lions, tigers, and bears combined. This number is on the rise. And yeah, I know, elephants are endangered, alright? I know all about the illegal ivory trade and habitat loss and yada yada yada. I don't care. I know, at least on an intellectual level, that it would be bad if all the elephants in the world died out. I just don't like them. Like I said, the more we've learned about elephants, the more like us they seem to be. Some see this as cute or even endearing and inspiring. But it scares the shit out of me. There are some human traits in particular that I would be very disturbed to learn elephants possess. Not many people know the story of Chang, an elephant from the Zurich Zoo. Back in the 1940s, Chang was well known for his nasty temper. But this didn't stop one resident typist, named Bertha Walt, from trying to befriend him. After spending weeks getting closer and closer to him, Walt decided to spend the night in his enclosure. The next morning, there was no sign of Walt anywhere, though there were splatters of blood on the walls of Chang's pen. If you need more evidence, his feces contained her bones, as well as her dress and even her handbag. And for any animal rights nuts reading this and thinking that this is just an example of the cruelty of captivity, wild elephants are no better. In 2011, a report came out about a female Asian elephant who went on a rampage in a village in India. According to the report, the elephant attacked the same village over the period of a few days in 2002. She killed 17 people in total. When she was finally brought down, examination of her stomach contents confirmed that she had eaten at least some of her victims. One explanation is that she was grief-stricken from the death of her calf, and filled with vengeful madness, engaged in otherwise unnatural aggressive actions. I'm not sure if I believe that, But whatever the reason, the fact remains that a wild elephant killed 17 people and ate some of them. There have also been isolated reports of elephants exhuming and eating human corpses. Look, I get it if you're skeptical, but I'm not here to publish a scientific paper. If you want proof, just Google it. It's all there. You might also be wondering why a person who's scared of elephants knows so much about them. Well, know your enemy, right? We know that not all people are good. We know that, for whatever reason, some of us are driven to do bad things. Horrible things. Unspeakable things. Would it change the way you look at an elephant if you knew that, behind that thick skull, was the mind of someone like Hannibal Lecter or Jeffrey Dahmer? Just think about that. The mind of a serial killer or cannibal in the body of an 8-ton, 12-foot-tall monster with huge spikes sticking out of its mouth. It isn't fiction. They're out there. I haven't always been so scared of them. Like most kids growing up, I routinely saw them in cartoons, books, movies, video games, etc. They were almost always cute and friendly, though there were occasionally some that made them aggressive and frightening. However, unlike most kids growing up in California, I actually had the opportunity to get close to real elephants. Just a few minutes from my house in San Andreas was the Performing Animal Wildlife Sanctuary, or PAWS. They first opened up a couple of years before I was born. Basically, they would take in animals that had been the victims of the exotic animal trade or been abused in performing roles in circuses and movies and such. They had tons of stuff: panthers, monkeys, bears, and of course, elephants. I remember they had, like, maybe 6 or so, both African and Asian. Because of the proximity to our house, I remember many weekends spent at PAWS. Even then, though I wasn't outright afraid of them, the 5-year-old me recognized pretty quickly a discrepancy between real elephants and the gentle giants of fiction. But as I got older, the trips to PAWS became less and less frequent, before they more or less ceased altogether by the time I was about 12. Needless to say, my priorities were elsewhere by then. I really was pretty much the epitome of a typical American teenager, with all of the stupidity and recklessness that entails. Seriously, while learning to drive, I once ran myself over with my own car. Tell me how a responsible adult does that. There was a girl. There's always a girl. This one was tall, very athletic, and had a red pixie cut. At any other school, she'd probably have been ruthlessly taunted, but she spared herself at least some of that fate by becoming the MVP of the high school basketball team. As such, she was pretty much the most popular girl in school. You can kinda see where this is going, can't you? My friend, Dan, and I made a wager. He would have to ask her out on a date by a certain time, and she would have to accept. If they didn't go out by a certain date, he would lose and I would win. Now, you might be thinking that the girl, Jenny, was all stuck up since she was so popular, but actually she seemed genuinely interested from what I could tell. And to my surprise, they actually did manage to go out. But not until 2 days after the cutoff point. So what was at stake, you ask? The loser would have to go into the elephant habitat and pause. Hey, I said we were stupid. Don't act like this is so different from some of the things you and your friends did. It was surprisingly easy to break in. The elephants require a lot of space, and the farthest edges don't have the same level of security as the parts of the enclosure closer to the guest area. We got as close as we could by car, and then continued on foot through a dense forest. It was pretty late, after 10 p.m., so we used flashlights to find our way. It was a cloudy night, so neither the stars nor the moon were of any help to us. Even with our flashlights, we walked into plenty of low-lying tree branches. If you think about it for long enough, you'll notice that most fences built to keep in animals aren't actually very strong. Most of the fences I've seen around horses weren't strong enough to withstand a good kick, nor were they high enough for the horse to not jump over. Turns out that fences are more about establishing boundaries in a lot of cases, and not so much about preventing escape at all costs. In this case, all there was separating the elephants from us were a few wires tied between wooden poles. Of course, the elephants were strong enough to break out if they wanted to. But apparently, since they had enough space to roam on the property, and since this is where they were fed and watered, they just didn't want to. That's as well as I can understand it, anyway. I stayed by the tree line, and he easily passed between the wires and into the habitat. Like I said, it was a really big space, and at first, there weren't any elephants around. For the bet, he had to stay in there for 1 hour. And so we waited. And waited. And after a while, I was beginning to regret not betting that he'd give me his PlayStation instead. At about 50 minutes in, we heard a very deep rumbling coming from somewhere out in the field. We were both on our feet, shining our flashlights like maniacs, trying to find it. Another fun fact about elephants. Despite weighing multiple tons, they move silently. No T-Rex style earth-shaking. We didn't find it until it was only about 50 feet away from him. It was a bull, a big one, even by elephant standards. He was an Asian elephant, with a pair of very prominent ivory tusks. His wrinkled skin was dark brown, with speckled patches of orange on his face running down his trunk. At first, he didn't seem particularly agitated. No thunderous trumpeting, no flaring of the ears, no shaking of the head. He just strode over toward Dan, seemingly out of nothing more than sheer curiosity. The only sound we could hear from him was a low growl coming from inside. Both Dan and I agreed that 50 minutes was close enough to an hour when a bull elephant starts to take an interest in you. Dan started to approach the wire fence very slowly, keeping his eyes fixed on the elephant. But just a few steps in, the elephant erupted into an attack. With a horrific roar, the elephant pounced forward with startling speed and grabbed Dan in its trunk before either of us realized what was going on. He was screaming with such terror that his voice didn't even seem like his. The bull tossed him onto the ground like a rag doll with ease, and when Dan fell back to earth, he could barely crawl. His flashlight fell out of his hands and landed on the ground, leaving the scene pitch black for a moment, until the elephant dragged him back into the light. I was frozen in my tracks, torn between a screaming desire to run away and a desperate need to save my friend. I could only watch as the elephant began to tear off Dan's clothes as if they were tissue paper. Once Dan was nearly naked, The elephant reared up slightly on its hind legs and came back down on his ankles. The crack was so loud, I heard it even over Dan's tormented screaming. The assault left his lower legs flattened to a bloody pulp. His screams were intermingled with sobs at this point. The elephant next reached for Dan's exposed genitals. At first, it just fiddled with them, using the pointed finger at the end of its trunk in an almost playful fashion. But after the novelty apparently wore off, it grabbed his crotch and shook it viciously back and forth. With just a few tugs, the genitals were torn off completely in a bloody spurt before being carelessly tossed aside. The elephant stepped up with one of its forefeet onto Dan's stomach, slowly pushing down. The air was squeezed out of his body as more and more of the elephant's tonnage was pressed on top of him. With no air left inside, the screams stopped, even as a wide mouth and expression of terrified agony were frozen on his face. Still, a few twitches confirmed that he wasn't quite dead yet, for which I was sorry. Wrapping its trunk around his neck, the elephant tugged hard, and moments later, the head popped off with the headless corpse flopping to the ground in a pool of blood. The elephant seemed to play with the severed head like a ball in the circus, tossing it up and catching it in its trunk. But even this bored it, and not too long afterwards, the elephant brought the head to its mouth and began chewing it to bits, the bones of the skull splintering with each movement. Finally, the spectacle overtook me. I vomited right there by the trees. Unfortunately, the retching of my throat was enough to remind the bull of my presence there. Letting out more low rumbles from its gut, it turned toward me, picking up the decapitated body of my best friend in its trunk. It shook the limp body back and forth as if to show off, before bull-rushing the wired fence. That was what finally snapped me out of my frigid stance and sent me bolting through the trees back to the car. I didn't look back for even 1 second, even as I heard the snapping of the wires and the groaning of the strained poles. Weakened from throwing up and floundering in the dark, I tripped many times, only to scramble awkwardly back to my feet. Thankfully, no matter how strong or fast the elephant was, the trees still acted as a barrier between him and me. I could still hear him crashing through the foliage by the time I got to my car and sped off mindlessly down the dirt road. I don't know if he saw me racing away. I didn't check my mirrors to see. I spent the next day in the police department being interviewed by officers and filling out paperwork. A short while after I came in, the head elephant keeper from Paws arrived to the station. After hearing what happened to Dan from me, she mercifully decided not to press charges, though not before giving me a few choice words. According to her, and a few officers who were at the scene that morning, there was no sign of either the bull or of Dan's body, save a few splatters of blood on the grass. Thankfully, none of the other elephants had followed it out and were still in the enclosure. However, this was no coincidence if the head keeper was to be believed. According to her, the bull's name was Prince. He was a recent addition, having only arrived at the sanctuary about 3 weeks earlier, something I would have known if I bothered to read the paper. He was a former member of the Ringling Brothers Circus, where he was involved with a number of accidents during his time there, both on and off stage. Paws was suspicious when this healthy young bull in his prime was retired so early, but they were happy to receive him nonetheless. From day one, there were problems with Prince. He was quiet and reserved, and even the other elephants were wary of him. 3 days after arriving, he had challenged one of the other elephants, a larger African bull, to a fight. It took tranquilizers to break up the fighting, and by that point, the other bull had sustained several severe gores, while Prince had barely any marks at all. After that, he was often required to be actively separated from the rest of the herd, who wanted nothing to do with him. With no other elephants or people to torment, he would just wander the grounds aimlessly, having fun with any small mammals or birds he happened to find. As it turns out, our dare would have been all for naught, if not for Prince. The elephants are locked in their barn during the night, but the lock to Prince's stall had been smashed to pieces sometime in the night. He must have sensed he had a new friend to play with. One thing that didn't strike me until some time later was how Prince had dragged Dan back into the flashlight's path before getting started. It seemed random at first, but then, as the keeper was talking about him, it made sense to me. Prince wasn't just enjoying dismembering Dan. He was also enjoying my horror witnessing it. This is where the real horror of an elephant's humanity comes into play. There was once a quote from The Simpsons that went along the lines of, "Animals are a lot like people. Some of them act bad because they've had a hard life or been mistreated, but, like people, some of them are just jerks." Yeah, and some of them are goddamn psychopaths. I don't know if it was a life living in the circus, or if he was just born that way, but for whatever reason, Prince had a streak of evil in him. Like Chang, or the rogue elephant in India, he was driven to kill needlessly. I can't speak for those other two, but for Prince, I can tell you without doubt or hesitation that he savored every second of it. He absolutely loved inflicting agony and death on things weaker than him. When I looked into those red eyes, I was staring at the disturbed mind of a sadistic butcher inside the body of the most powerful land animal alive. One of the most disturbing things about serial killers is how unassuming they are. John Wayne Gacy was once a well-respected member of his community, up until the community realized that Pogo the Clown was responsible for the 33 missing boys. That dork who runs the motel down the road, his mother's corpse is sitting in his bedroom. That elephant your kids are riding at the fair, God only knows what he's thinking. They didn't find Dan's body until 3 weeks later, over 100 miles from Paws. As to be expected, it was in an even more mangled condition than before. I guess Prince wore out his old toy. I don't know for certain if he found a new one. There were reports later of missing children in a few of the counties around San Andreas, but there's no way of pinning any of them directly on Prince. You'd think the trail of a bull elephant would be easy to follow, and yet to this day Prince has never been found. It is unknown whether or not he's even still alive. I know that it must sound pretty unbelievable that a creature weighing several tons and twice as tall as a man could go so many years without being found. But then, you'd be surprised how easy wild elephants can just disappear into their surroundings. Besides, do you think any of the parents believed their children when they said that an elephant wandered through their backyard? Yesterday there was a report of a savagely dismembered corpse found in Baghdad, Arizona. The word used in the article I read was trampled. I suppose bison or deer or pronghorn could have done it. But it does make me wonder. It makes me wonder if that farmer knows what happened to all of those missing crops. If that dog knows where such big scat came from. If that little girl knows better than to get too close to the pretty elephant.